European history seminars for this semester. It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Kathleen Brosnan, who is a scholar I've known since 2016 when she came to a meeting that I held at King's College in London that was about the idea of wine studies and food studies. So Kathy gave by far and away the most clear and sophisticated response at our plenary to the question, if we have food studies, do we need wine studies? And I'm quite grateful to her for that, because that sort of set up some of the directions of the way that we have done some of our very interdisciplinary studies since then. So Kathy and I have collaborated on a few things. She's been here for a week in Newcastle doing some research, and this is a part of sharing ideas with colleagues. So Kathleen Brosnan is the Travis Chair of Modern American History at the University of Oklahoma. She's a member of the Board of Directors of the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations, founder and board member of the Women's Environmental History Network, and past president of the American Society for Environmental History. She received her JD from the University of Illinois and PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 1999. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, Professor Brosnan has authored or edited 7 books in US or comparative environmental history. Her most recent books include Mapping Nature Across the Americas in 2021, The Greater Plains, Rethinking a Region's Environmental Histories 2021, City of Lake and Prairie, Chicago's Environmental History 2020. She's currently working on 2 books, an environmental history of the Napa Valley wine industry and a comparative transnational study of the transfer of European viticulture around the globe. Welcome, Kathy.
Thanks. Thanks, Julie. Can they see the slides?
Oh, we should try sharing again. Sorry, it's me again,
That's okay.
guys.
Yes.
Sorry, that's one thing I didn't do. Yeah, so, well, the welcome was good.
Well,
So
it was more generous than it should have been.
It's not a touch screen, you idiot. I'm so glad we're recording all of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much.
Here we are. My pleasure. Look at us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to discuss my scholarship, and thank you, Julie, for that much too kind introduction. It's been one of the better pleasures of the last almost 10 years has been getting to know Julie so well. Before I begin today, I wanted to acknowledge you just told me that the Ecological Nation and their elders. I'm honored to be here in their traditional lands. I wanted to briefly put my talk in some context. In terms of my own scholarship, as Julie mentioned, I'm currently working on 2 projects. And working on 2 book projects is a surefire way to ensure you're probably not going to get either one finished in a timely fashion. The first, as Julie mentioned, is an environmental history of the Napa wine industry. More specifically, I'm arguing that the Napa Valley offers a distinctive window of the consequences of consumerism. Environmental historians tend to focus primarily on production systems, in part because it is more difficult to track the specific consequences of individual consumers' choices. And indeed, the Napa book will discuss production at some length. However, Napa, for those who haven't been there, Napa, while large in reputation, is in fact quite small in actual size. Moreover, it's a place that over time became almost universally dedicated in all its activity to wine and its attendant industries. So in some ways it offers this little laboratory about the impacts of consumption and the growing affluence that defines Napa. I'm also, of course, very interested in the different institutions that have undergirded the wine industry, such as the University of California. And I'm concerned, of course, about who has borne the burdens of shifting consumer choices, from the displaced Indigenous peoples to the immigrant agricultural workers, and from the diminished biodiversity to the introduction of industry-threatening insects. The second book project will be a comparative study of the transfer of European viticulture around the globe, which I'm arguing is both a form of ecological imperialism and settler colonialism. At this stage, I've conducted research in 4 other countries and hope to visit more. And I'm here, as Jill mentioned, in Australia, working on this project. There's an expression we have in the States about graft, and some would call it a boondoggle, that I've chosen this topic, forcing me to go to wine-producing countries, but I'm getting away with it. And I'm also working right now on an essay on global environmental issues in viticulture in the 20th century for a new collection on the history of wine that Bloomsbury is publishing. So this paper today merges some of the elements of these different projects, may even wind up as a separate article at some point. Might be a little bit all over the place, I hope not. But as a consequence of all that, I very much look forward to your questions, comments, and suggestions. Okay, so here we go. In June 2012, the US Library of Congress hosted a conference in Washington, D.C. The purpose of the conference was to explore 3 events which the library claimed shaped America's knowledge-based democracy. The 3 events were the founding of the National Academy of Sciences in 1863, the funding of more than 1,400 public Carnegie libraries between 1886 and 1923, and finally the passage of the Morrill Land-Grant Colleges Act in 1862. And it's this last event, the Morrill Act and its sequelae, which will be the focus of my talk today. The Morrill Act was primarily the result of efforts by Justin Morrill, then a US representative of and later the US Senator from the state of Vermont. Largely self-educated, Morrill would become the longest-serving member of the US Congress in the nation's first 160 years. He became quite influential. According to the historian of the Library of Congress, James Billington, Morrill was, quote, arguably the most important elected official in creating a nationwide infrastructure for higher education and reinforcing knowledge-based democracy in the second half of the 19th century. Addressing Morrill's legacy in 1955, Oliver Wilhelm, the president of Oklahoma State University, not my university, Oklahoma State, the bad guys. The president of Oklahoma State observed that, quote, the Morrill Act opened the doors for higher learning to peoples in all walks of life in America. Land-grant colleges have been founded, supported, and stimulated by the people. And today, democracy in education is a fundamental characteristic of a land-grant college. In 2012, while celebrating the sesquicentennial of the law, Gene Block, the chancellor of the University of California, Los Angeles, similarly reiterated long-held perceptions about the democratization of education. Quote, the Morrill Act expanded access to higher education to all segments of society, not just the sons of the privileged elites. And it raised, he said, our level of prosperity, both in California and across the nation. We are a powerful engine of opportunity, providing education, research, and service that drive our state and our nation forward and enriching millions of lives around the globe and exploitation. Now, not surprisingly, a number of scholars have challenged this narrative of supposedly unblemished social advancement, noting, of course, persistent disparities in access to education and educational resources based on class, race, indigeneity, gender, and a number of other factors. More recently, and more importantly for us today, scholars and journalists have looked at land-grant institutions as agents of settler colonialism, largely because of the massive transfer of indigenous lands that accompanied the implementation of the law. But I want to build on that recent scholarship to make a slightly different argument. I argue that the university was and remains an agent of settler colonialism through the curriculum that has long undergirded the land-grant college, a curriculum that supported and promoted specific land uses and transformed expropriated lands into settler properties while fostering hegemonic cultural landscapes through the advancement, dissemination, and application of, quote, useful knowledge. I'm in particular interested in the application of scientific agriculture and even more particularly in viticulture or the science of grape growing. So in the 19th century, Nation-state bureaucracies in the United States became entrenched as a series of federal laws facilitated their emergence in power. Bureaucratic structures enhanced state capacity by justifying the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and as the political scientist James C. Scott has argued, making complex human societies and a complex natural world seem more legible. Now, as I'll explain, these laws and some of these agencies and other institutions also furthered the goals of the settler state. Historians of rural America, such as Catherine McNichol Stock and Deborah Fitzgerald, have effectively argued that agriculture and the countryside served as a staging ground for the construction of the modern US state, and I would add, for the construction of the settler state. In 1862, Congress passed a law formerly known as, quote, an act donating public lands to the several states and territories, which may provide colleges for the benefits of agriculture and the mechanic arts. They were not known for concision and naming their laws. Better known as the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, or just simply for our purposes, the Morrill Act, the law provided the means to establish, institutions in each state that educated people of all classes in agriculture, mechanical arts, and home economics. This is how it worked. The law gave each state 30,000 acres of land in the form of scrip for each of its senators and representatives. So if you and every state has 2 senators. If you have 1 representative, you've got 90,000 acres. You had 3 representatives, you're up to 150,000. Money for the land sales was then to be placed in a college endowment fund. The historian Nathan Sorber contends that born amid a civil war that confronted irrevocable visions of the future of the United States, the land grant college assumed a role in facilitating the rise of a capitalist, industrialist economy, and as I mentioned, a modern bureaucratized nation state. And I would add that it facilitated the spread of commercial agriculture across the United States. So let's briefly take a moment to consider the Civil War context in which the US Congress acted following the secession of southern states. The Morrill Act was one of 3 key laws that passed within just 6 weeks in the summer of 1862. When I look at our Congress today, I find it amazing that they could pass these 3 major laws in 6 weeks, but they did. The second law was the Homestead Act, which I suspect you've all heard of. It provided 160 acres of federal land to adult heads of families who agreed to farm the land, or in the words of the poet Carl Sandburg, quote, a farm free to any man who wanted to put a plow into unbroken sod. The third law was the Pacific Railway Act, which offered government incentives such as construction bonds and land grants to assist, quote, men of talent, men of character, men who are willing to invest in developing the nation's first transcontinental railroad line. Taken together, these 3 laws both fulfilled long-held notions of manifest destiny among white Americans and also provided a proving ground for Republican ideologies of political economy. The 3 laws ensured also the spread of white settlers across the continent from ocean to ocean by providing new means for the distribution of what were called public lands into private hands and by erasing indigenous claims to such lands. The railroads transected those lands, pulling the nation into modernity, and land-grant colleges reinforced hegemonic views of what constituted productive use of these lands. Speaking of the law that bore his name, Morrill later said his fundamental purpose was, quote, to offer an opportunity for a liberal and larger education to larger members, and not merely to those destined to sedentary professions. I don't know if he meant professors. But to those needing higher education for the world's business, for industrial pursuits. The legislation was intended to elevate science through higher education, and land-grant colleges were entwined with the nation-building goals of the victorious North. An important objective was to increase agricultural productivity, freeing more men from farm labor and funneling them into cities where their work would fuel industrial growth. Moreover, taken together, these three laws furthered, as I mentioned, the expropriation of indigenous lands, and more significantly, the transformation of those lands into something new that served the long-term goals of the settler states. Now, to take advantage of the many benefits of the Morrill Act, the California State Legislature established the University of California in 1868 as a land-grant university. So it's a the university itself is a creature of the state of California, but as a land-grant college, it's also an extension of the nation state, or specifically the settlers. The university's authority and influence as a nation-state actor through the practical application of its curriculum would be enhanced and expanded with other federal legislation. The Hatch Act funded agricultural experiment stations under the direction of land-grant universities to pass along information on soil, minerals, and plant growths. These stations, including, for example, an experimental vineyard later in Napa Valley, became the foundation for cooperative extension services. The Smith-Lever Act funded cooperative extension services. These services send a university agent to nearly every county in the United States. Extension agents disseminated information on agriculture, home economics, 4-H, policy developments. And over time, these agents would develop specialties pertinent to the regions they serve. As the county commissioner in Napa once told me, we don't focus on rutabagas, we focus on wine grapes. These state-sponsored university services would play a role in making California an agricultural behemoth. It's hard to overstate how important California is to American agriculture. I was looking for statistics and I came across one, all kudos to Wikipedia on this one, to give some sense of the size and scope. In 2007, for example, California shipped more agricultural products by plane, just by plane. They also shipped by trucks and trains and ships, shipped more agricultural products by plane than 23 other states combined to deliver by all modes of transportation. California is big. And the university came to play a significant role in the growth and maturation of California's wine industry generally, and in its most famed region, Napa Valley. And even at this stage, with the growth of the wine industry in other parts of the United States, California still accounts for about 85% of wine production in the United States. Now, in terms of California, I want to mention that there are a diverse group of peoples and nations who historically and currently call the land within California's political boundaries their home. Today, there are 109 federally recognized tribes within California, and there are more than 40 self-identified tribes or tribal bands that are seeking federal recognition. Rather than recognize all of those here today, I want to acknowledge the Napa Valley's Indigenous peoples. Napa Valley, located north of San Francisco Bay, as you can see on the map on your left. The Napa Valley encompasses the traditional lands of the Wapo tribe, whose homelands extended into parts of what are now Napa, Sonoma, and Lake counties. Lake County isn't on that map, but it's just north of Napa County. At its peak in the late 18th century, the Wapo tribe had as many as 8,000 members, perhaps. A hunting and gathering tribe that ate fish, berries, fowl, and wild animals, such as deer, squirrels, and bears. They tended to eat what was available seasonally. To ensure favorable habitat for desired animals, they used controlled burns. For centuries, the Wapo people had shaped the lush Napa wetlands and oak savannas and essentially formed the landscape that provided the foundation for settler communities and the agricultural activities that followed. Many of the white settlers who arrived assumed that those lands existed that way naturally, but in fact they've been shaped by the WAPO. Settler colonial states include many wine-producing nations, such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, and the United States. In the United States, as I've mentioned, land-grant universities are essential to the larger settler objectives. Settler colonial projects, as we know, sought land. Even when white societies initially relied on indigenous labor, the historian Patrick Wolf observes, they ultimately aimed for, he says, quote, the elimination of the native. To give an example, in Napa Valley in the 1830s and 1840s, white settlers exploited indigenous workers. But with exposure to contagious diseases, growing demographic pressures, and forced relocations, the WAPO's numbers dipped to perhaps 200 in Napa Valley by 1860, and few remained in their Napa homelands at the end of the 19th century and weren't even counted in the census. As many of you know, settlers' colonial societies around the globe began with the idea of terra nullius, or the perception that lands in long-term use and managed by indigenous peoples were empty, underused, or, quote, virgin, as settlers described Napa. Asserting sovereignty and legal authority, the new arrivals imported legal systems that codified supposedly proper uses of natural resources and carved indigenous lands into private property. Despite the overwhelming dispossession of indigenous lands, however, settler colonialism has failed to eliminate the native. Thus, the U.S. state has needed to reassert its supposed domination of the land, and to justify this domination not only by dispossession, but by the purposeful and directed use of the land towards certain civilized and commercial ends. We see this effort in the three laws that generated the land-grant university, experimental stations, and agricultural extension services. And I think we see this effort in the viticultural and enological research at the University of California across 140 years. In their article, and I think this is from 2018, I'm not going to scroll to my endnotes to tell you, but I think it's from 2018 in the Highline News. In their article, Land Grab Universities, Robert Lee, a historian, and Tristan Atto, a journalist and a member of the Kiowa tribe, joined others, such as the historian Margaret Nash, to expose the massive wealth transfer that masqueraded as a generous donation of land by the federal government to the individual states. They write, quote, the Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the act redistributed nearly 11 million acres, an area larger than the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. And if we look at California, and I want to explain, the land that the different universities were able to claim title to was not necessarily in their state. They could get land in other parts of the country. So some 32 land grant institutions from across the United States received a share of more than 1.7 million acres in California alone, much taken from California's indigenous peoples following the Maricopa War in the 1850s and under treaties that have never been ratified by the United States Senate. The University of California, Leonato explained, located all of its grants among these stolen lands. To capitalize on the 150,000 acres it received under the Morrill Act, the university ran a real estate operation that sold plots on installment plans, generating, as Leon Atton called it, generating a, quote, lucrative combination of principal and interest payments. And in the late 19th century, income from this fund, traceable to the lands of Miwok, Yokut, Gabrielino, Mayudo, Homo, and many others, covered as much as a third of the University of California's annual operating expenses. Beyond these land grabs, however, I would argue that through their research and teaching, the very reasons for which these institutions were established, land grant colleges advanced the settler colonial project. Land-grant universities like the University of California taught courses that emphasized commercial crops and scientific farming practices. They embedded assumptions, cultural assumptions about cuisine in their home economic courses. And in doing so, settlers invested in the land beyond the mere commercial expansion of an empire. They increasingly infused their efforts with rhetoric calling forth larger civilizing purposes. This is especially true with wine. Historian Erica Hanikel argues, quote, growing grapes was not just a material practice, it was a powerful ideology, a set of aesthetics, and ubiquitous discourse of national power. Scholars Julie McIntyre and John Jermoff share a similar narrative about Australia's Hunter Valley and the usurpation of Aboriginal lands there. Quote, the answer to the question, why wine grapes in the Hunter, was a combination of imperial ideologies. A concentration of early settlers in the Hunter were influenced by currents of thought about wine growing as a higher form of cultivation, a symbol of respectable civilized settlement. But these ideas were not limited to just what scholars said. And if I had access to some of my research back in the States, I would show you all these wonderful quotes from the 19th century in the United States. Instead, I'll give you one from the 20th century, which I can find online. To give you an example, Robert Mondavi, a seminal figure in the Napa Valley wine industry, in 1966, he opened Napa Valley's first new major winery following the repeal of Prohibition. Mondavi observed, quote, wine has been with us since the beginning of civilization. It is temperate, civilized, sacred, romantic, a mealtime beverage recommended in the Bible. Wine has been praised for centuries by statesmen, philosophers, poets, and scholars. Wine in moderation is an integral part of our culture, heritage, and gracious way of life. And it was many of these ideas about civilization that prompted people to continue to pursue viticulture, even when there were more profitable crops to be had. So the introduction of European viticulture in the Americas, Africa, or Australia, and the imposition of the supposedly genteel civilization it embodied were never benign activities. These were acts of ecological imperialism as well as settler colonialism. And indeed, I would argue that ecological imperialism is an essential aspect of settler colonialism, that these two things go hand in hand. The historian Alfred Crosby introduced the concept of ecological imperialism back in the 1980s, arguing that the exchange of species was one of the most important elements in the expansion of human settlement. Ecological imperialism involved the intentional introductions of crops and livestock, and often the accidental introductions of diseases, pests, and weeds. He looked at a millennium from 900 to 1900 BCE and argued that the European introduction of biological species was an essential part of the success of European colonists. In fact, in a phrase that has become obviously very criticized over time, he called places like Australia, the United States, or Canada neo-Europes. But the cultivation of Vitis vinifera, the grape native to the Mediterranean used in most wines, was part of this ecological imperialism. It usurped indigenous plants that had previously grown in native soils. And I should add, despite how we might feel at the end of a particularly difficult day, maybe a day where we've had to grade a lot of student essays, no matter how we may feel at the end of the day, wine is not now and never has been essential to human sustenance. Its importance is not in sustaining our lives. Physically. Its importance is grounded in its various cultural meanings, from religion to the idea of good life for modern society. Thus, this particular food crop and its usurpation of indigenous plants really symbolize this supposedly higher, more civilized use of the land that justified the taking of the land. So, The University of California would come to provide and continues to provide viticulture and enological expertise that facilitated the transformation of these expropriated lands into the civilized settlement. Still one of the world's leading universities on these subtopics. By 1880 in California, concerns about, by 1880 in California, concerns about wine quality, the spread of a destructive aphid called phylloxera, and the reluctance of some industry participants to address either issue, led the California legislature to conclude that its authority was essential to resolve the problems. It issued a two-part edict. First, the legislature created a state board of viticultural commissioners, which drew on industry participants. Second, it mandated research on viticulture and enology at the University of California, the state's land-grant institution. Located in Berkeley, just north of the city of Oakland, and along the San Francisco Bay, the university had already been engaging in a range of agricultural research since its founding in 1868. The legislature's edict divided funding between that viticultural board of the university, which sowed the seeds of discord. Conflicts quickly arose between the practical-minded board members who sought quick solutions that clashed with Professor Eugene Hilgard's more methodical research. Hilgard was a German-born, American-raised, European-educated professor of agricultural chemistry. He had first lectured about the danger of phylloxera in 1876, within 1 year of his arrival at the University of California. From the beginning of his time in Berkeley, Hilgard was a determined proponent of high-quality wines and better winemaking practices. As I said, his positions often led him at odds with winemakers who emphasized high yields and quick profitability over long-term standards. Now, for various reasons I won't go into here, the viticultural board would disband in 1894, showing very few results. But the university's mandate continued to conduct agricultural research and viticulture and enology research until at least the beginning of Prohibition, or the legal prevention of the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages, with certain exceptions, under the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution. Prohibition temporarily ended wine research at the university. With Prohibition, all but a few wineries, those producing seasonal or sacramental or kosher wines, and given the amount they were producing, there seemed to have been a lot of religious conversions. But with Prohibition, all but a few wineries closed. Their cooperage was dismantled or left to rot. Vineyardists increasingly planted poor quality, thick-skinned grape varieties suitable for shipping and home production, because under the enabling law, the Wrested Act, people could produce up to 200 gallons of wine at home. They just couldn't sell it. It was very bad wine. Distribution networks ended. It's hard to overstate again how devastating this was to the wine industry. Prohibition is finally repealed in December of 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment. And just shortly about a year later, the University of California opened in 1935 a new division of viticulture and enology on its campus in Davis, California, to address the wine industry's dire condition. The University of California had shifted its experimental farm from Berkeley to Davis, some 60 miles away, in 1909. Anybody who knows the San Francisco area knows the expanding urbanization was putting a huge amount of pressure on that farm. And Davis would eventually become home to the university's College of Agriculture in the 1930s. The university's viticulture and enology research was intended to be a substitute for Europe's greater experience. And again, it was supposed to help bring the industry out of those dire conditions. The division's founders believed that quality in the bottle was a direct result of quality in the vineyard, and thus they dispensed with traditions that had historically separated the study of viticulture from enology. They also believed that improved quality would push California away from the overproduction of fortified wines there was a surplus of fortified wines, wines with a much higher alcohol content, that tended to contribute to images of intemperance and undermined that supposedly civilizing virtue of wine cultivation. So researchers Maynard Amarin and A.J. Winkler instituted a long-range program designed to show growers the importance of planting better and better suited varieties for specific climates, particularly as Californians had turned to varietal labeling as a way to distinguish their products from European vintages. Analysis of samples from all regions supported their assessment of some dozen grape varieties. They recommended more appropriate varieties to growers for their environmental conditions. Foundational to their research was an unrelenting message that Winkler articulated. California could produce, quote, properly made products of the better and really fine grape varieties of grape under suitable soil and climatic conditions. In other words, they were arguing that in the end, California could compete with Europe. Now, the lessons did not immediately take hold statewide. I think one of the reasons the lessons didn't take hold was in part because consumer tastes were only changing slowly. It would not be until 1967 in the United States that the sales of dry table wines outstripped the sales of sweet wines, which had to be more fortified. But there were some hopeful signs in Napa County and a few other places where better varieties were earning higher prices. In response, Napa growers planted more and more of these grapes. Thus, as that domestic demand for dry wines finally took hold in the late 1960s, Napa was almost alone and having a supply of good grapes to feed it. Now, as consumer tastes continued to evolve, and California's vineyards expanded substantially in the 1970s and 80s, graduates of the Viticulture and Enology Division at UC Davis filled vineyards across California, the United States, and really across the globe. In industry, actors turned to university specialists on many topics, from phylloxera-resistant rootstock to new fermentation methods. And as an agent of the settler state, justifying not only the expropriation of land, but its civilized use in wine production, the university also worked on shaping consumer taste along this path with research on the sensory appreciation of wine. One example is the Davis Wine Aroma Wheel. Ann Noble, a wine chemistry professor and the first woman hired on the faculty of the UC Davis Viticulture and Enology Department in 1974, created this wine aroma wheel around 1984. She and others upgraded it over time. It's divided into several sections to help consumers visualize the different flavors, scents, and aromatic qualities found in most red and white wines, regardless of the grape variety. Each of these unique fragrances found in wine are due to the grapes being coupled with environmental conditions in which they're planted and cultivated, as well as choices made by the winemaker. But I bring it up to show to you that the university was deeply involved in promoting certain forms of land use through many, many means. Now, as a minor aside, before I get to my conclusion, I've focused on the University of California here as a land-grant university. But I think we could even push this argument to see the ways in which all public universities across the United States are highly dependent on federal research dollars and thus too serve as agents of the settler state. Perhaps not through an agricultural curriculum, but through other courses and scholarship, or in the case of my institution, and persistent and often offensive symbolism. So I've come to you from the University of Oklahoma, where we gather, teach, and learn on land placed by its creator in the care and protection of the Caddo and Wichita people, and originally shared by indigenous nations such as the Kiowa, Apache, Comanche, and Osage. 39 sovereign tribal nations reside in what is currently known as the state of Oklahoma, many as a result of settler colonial policies of removal that were designed to erase indigenous peoples. My school, the University of Oklahoma, is not the land-grant institution in our state. We do not teach agricultural courses. And we have a very active Indigenous Studies program. We have a new Native Nations Center, a Research and Policy Institute situated within our Office of Tribal Relations. We're doing some fantastic things. Yet the landed memory of settler colonialism is constantly reinforced at my home institution in a way that, to be honest, gets far wider attention than the Native Nations Center. When the University of Oklahoma scores a touchdown at a home game in American football, a pair of ponies named Boomer and Sooner pull the Sooner Scooter. Try to say all that really fast. A pair of ponies named Boomer and Sooner pull the Sooner Scooter, a small version of the settlers' Conestoga wagons, across the field to celebrate the touchdown. Just to give you some sense of the meaning of these words. Early agitators for white settlement of Indian territory were called boomers. The Sooners, and by the way, we are the University of Oklahoma Sooners. The Sooners were land-run participants who entered unoccupied land early and hid until the legal time of entry to lay quick claim to good homesteads. In other words, the Sooners were the cheaters. OU embodies settler colonialism and it promotes its imagery to millions every game day. Okay, couldn't let my school off the hook.
Are people aware of it? Is it one of those kind of
Let's come to
histories
that.
that
Let me finish up real quick. In conclusion, historically what people ate and drank and how they ate and drank it were intrinsically environmental and intrinsically cultural, based on local resources, but also dictated by rituals and traditions. The importation of vitis vinifera constituted forms of ecological imperialism and settler colonialism, with all that they entailed, embodying complex values ranging from religious sanctity to ethnic pride and elitism. Wine was part of a material culture carried from the settlers' homes, reflecting their image of civilized society. Settlers and their successors have continuously shaped wine and its meanings in new social milieus, physical environments across the world. Lorenzo Verancini, a scholar in settler colonial studies, reminds us, quote, settler colonialism makes sense, especially if it is understood globally, and that we live a settler colonial global present. Settler colonialism and ecological imperialism are ongoing processes well beyond the initial appropriation of Indigenous lands, the implementation of the Morrill Act in the 19th century. The land-grant university has continued to be a critical agent of colonialism up to this present moment. In the case of the University of California, its viticulture and ecological research has extended the settler colonial project into the 21st century and reinforced the civilizing objectives of this project. The supposed success of commercial agriculture generally, an issue we might debate, as well as viticulture specifically, provided a justification for the settler colonial project's continuation. And to some extent, we are all embedded in that project. So I thank you for listening as I work through these ideas, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy. It's tremendous work, so interesting to me. It reflects and intersects with what we're working on in Australia as well. It's just fantastic. So I'm just going to pause for a second and say we started a little bit late because I ran from a class and particularly wanted to introduce Kathy. I am also going to regretfully leave right now, but that's because I have to teach a class at 12. I have 2 more classes in a row, so that'll be 5 hours teaching today. So this has been a lovely break. But could I just, Kathy, would you mind taking the questions on Kathy's behalf for me? And I'm just I'm gonna take my laptop. I'm gonna thank those of you who are on Zoom. I just would also very briefly mention, this will just take 10 seconds, that I'm gonna take Kathy out to dinner at Scratchley's this evening at 6. So if anyone would like to join us, just email me and let me know that I could include you in the booking. It's Kathy's last night in Newcastle, and she likes seafood. And there's a great Hunter wine list actually. So I'm just, okay, 3 of us, great. Alrighty, so that's terrific. So I'm sorry to just hijack the discussion for a second there, but I'm going to go and teach some lovely students. Yeah, that was fantastic.
See you later.
I'm going to message you about how to meet up.
Thank
Kathy's
you.
gonna
Do I
take
need this? I need this so I can see some questions. Okay, I just have to check if I can actually read the chat.
A few of us enough, we can just.
Brilliant. Okay, well, if they come up on the screen, that's all, because it's controlled that way. So thank you so much. I have a question, but does anybody else have a question they would like to ask?
Maybe two.
Yeah, anyone online, if you could just sing out, because we're in a big room with the controls.
And the meeting is actually booked to run past 12
Yeah, thank
if
you.
it runs over.
Thanks very
by the way.
much. Thanks, Julie. Is there anyone who would like? Nancy, I can see you moving your.
I'm happy to ask a question. Thanks so much, Kathy. That was really fascinating. And as Julie just was saying, the parallels with what was happening in Australia are just striking. Not that we had land grant universities, but everything else. And so you talked about Wolfe and his ideas of settler colonization as elimination of the native. And I just wondered whether Indigenous people had access to any of the schemes that you were talking about today. Were they able to become students at these land grant institutions?
I want to talk about that, but I do want to give the caveat that I wouldn't define myself as a specialist in Indigenous studies. So I can talk about it generally, but I just want to put that caveat out there. I think that would come over time. But I think what is really happening at the end of the 19th century is a much more complicated history of moving Indigenous peoples in the states to reservation lands, often the creation of boarding schools for their education that were very much focused on vocational skills and very much designed at removing children from their families and culture, which I also know resonates with all of you. There was one of the more famous schools was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I can't remember the gentleman's name, but the supervisor of that school said something to the effect of, their goal was to kill the Indian to save the man. Very famous quotation. And so for the most part, these land grant institutions were not being opened to Native Americans. They were not being open to African Americans. And I forget the year, but there is subsequently another land grant act passed that creates a series of segregated land grant institutions for African Americans to keep them separated. So I don't know if that fully answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Amanda Wells, and then we have one from Tamsin. Amanda, did you want to speak yours, or would you like me to read it out for you? I'm happy to do so in the absence of sound. Okay, so Amanda says, some of this work reminds me very much of the links that Douglas Sackman found between citrus industry research and state institutional research in California. Have you found any links between the wine research groups and other horticultural research areas?
Yeah, I think Doug's book, Orange Empire, is fabulous, if you haven't read it. And I think in particular, one of the things that really resonates with Doug's work and my work is he gets into some ways, he has a separate article in the Journal of Environmental History in which he talks about the way in which oranges were marketed. And it actually brings about that same type of civilizing effort. And if you do read the literature on horticulture more generally, it is projected in the 19th century as a more elevated form of agriculture. That it requires a greater sophistication. And I think it's maybe the idea that agriculture has moved beyond just providing the basic needs of subsistence, but that it is also now providing this more elevated way of living, right? And so I do see a lot of connections to Doug's work. Yeah, his stuff is very good if you don't know it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Did anybody in the room have a question before I go to Tamsin, who's there? Okay, all right, Tamsin. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was amazing. I'm a historian of the university in the context of empire, and I'm writing an article at the moment on a kind of historiographic review article on universities and land grants, universities and the legacies of slavery, universities and the legacies of mining, and universities and kind of the expropriation of Indigenous knowledges. And so this is like bang center in the middle. And Nancy says there's no land grant universities in Australia, but there is one, and it's the University of Adelaide. And it makes me wonder actually, and its founder establishes the South Australian wine industry as well. And it makes me wonder whether there is a direct influence, and I'll find this out this afternoon, on of the Moral Act on the foundation of the University of Adelaide and that land grant in particular, because the Agricultural College is central to the founding of Adelaide University as well. So,
Tomorrow, by the way.
say again?
I leave for Adelaide tomorrow.
Oh, right. Well, anyway, I would love to have a email correspondence with you and get some of your references to cite in this article and your own work as well, especially if it's forthcoming, because it's really generative. And so what we're trying to do, this is my question, is bring together these literatures, which actually largely exist independently. There are some cross-fertilizations, but it's really interesting, I think, that that these four forms of extraction don't really talk to scholars working on these four forms of extraction in the modern university are not really talking to each other. So that's the aim of our big historiographic article. And so if anyone's got references, please send them to me. I'd love to include them. It's a global survey. But my question is, I've been reading Malcolm Harris's book Palo Alto, which you might know, which is on Palo Alto and Stanford. And, you know, one of the things he talks about there is also that the Pacific Highway Act, but the role of what we might call unfree labour in the construction of the railways, which is, of course, drives land expropriation and viticulture as well. Do you have any have you investigated that kind of notion of, I mean, it's not, sometimes those are direct legacies of slavery money that then are reinvested, but the category of unfree labour, which is a little bit broader than that of slavery in the US contexts, have you found that playing out in the context of the University of California as well?
First of all, I don't know that book, so thank you. I can't wait to read it now. And of course, Stanford is so closely associated with the railways because of where Stanford's money comes from. I don't know that I have literature or data on the university and on free labor. I do know, of course, it's part of the California wine industry story. And there's the use of Chinese laborers in that industry as well as in the railroads. So I don't know that I have an answer specific to the university. I'm sure it exists, I just don't know that I have an answer. So I will tell you though, an amusing and terrifying story. One of the great things about studying wine is the empirical research, going from tasting room to tasting room on the weekends. And I did a tour once at a place, Behringer Brothers Winery in Napa Valley. And this lovely young woman was giving us a tour, and she explained that the wine caves had been hewn out by Chinese workers because they like to work with their hands. While the Behringer Brothers, the founders, these German immigrants, love to till the soil. After my head exploded, I spoke with the manager very subtly over a glass of wine and said, you know, that's not quite accurate. You know, Chinese were banned from owning land. He had a very pained look on his face and said, I'll talk to her. So there's still ways, even as Napa County has come to recognize the labor of Chinese workers, and it is visible throughout the valley in these wine caves and the creation of these stone bridges. It's still trying to tell a fairy tale story about the exploitation of that labor. So I'm sorry I don't know more about the university, and it's really should know. Thank you. I'm eager to hear from you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. So, Julia, Jeanette said we can go over a little bit in terms of the room booking. I know some people might have had another commitment, so that's okay if you do, but we'll stick around here for a couple more questions, if that's all right with you, Kathy.
Sure.
Yeah, Julie had a question, I think. Oh, sorry, Vicky, you were saying. Sorry.
Well, yeah, it's great, Tamsin, that you're here, because the whole time I was listening, I was thinking, gotta put Kathy in touch with Tamsin, gotta put Kathy in touch with Tamsin. So that's really good. And a lot of my comments were along those lines, like there's all this great work that's been done here. But I think I just loved your paper. Just loved it, full stop. I could imagine you taking this right up to the present, and looking at the university's role. I suppose a couple of questions I had is, I guess as a historian of colonisation, I don't find it that surprising to say the university is an agent of settler colonialism, because, you know, it's part of, and they probably celebrated that, and in fact they continue with those things. And so I sort of wonder if it's worth problematising it a little bit to see how perhaps even as agents of colonisation they could also challenge and subvert the colonial project in some way as well. And then the other thought that occurred to me as I'm listening, I'm really interested in the concept of social reproduction at the moment, because I'm trying to look at the way care work it supports colonisation. And as I'm kind of been thinking around this stuff, I was thinking you can actually see universities as you know, factories of social reproduction, because of that sort of creating society work that universities do, rather than creating manufactured products for sale. And so I just wanted to lob that in, because I'm kind of thinking about that concept.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and again, more your area than mine, but I even think back to the way universities were structured along gender for so long, at least in the States and presumably here, with certain colleges which really were designed for women,
Yeah.
sometimes called home economic colleges of home economics, but then over time somehow the term ecology, human ecology was used in an abstraction of it, and these existed even when I started first teaching in 1999.
Yeah.
So I do think, they play those roles.
Yeah, I mean, the wine is such a great example of that, because you talk about how wine's significance is in its cultural meaning, rather than it being, you know, and that's kind of reminds me in a way of thinking about social reproduction, where it's not productive labour as such, but it's really vital and critical to the way the society establishes and maintains its establishment. And wine seems to be quite important in that.
By the way, I was scheduled to give a talk. They have something called the Rossi Lecture, sponsored by the Department of Viticulture and Enology at Davis, and I was scheduled, and then we had a pandemic. This was effectively the talk I was planning to give, and I was, to be honest, a little scared.
That's fantastic. Right, it's so interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We've had a thank you from Matt Bailey, who's had to go to a meeting. He says thanks for a great paper. I don't know if others, I can see the chat, and Tamsin would like your email, but I can't do it here quickly, so we'll organise that for you, Tamsin. Yeah,
It's real simply, it's my first initial and my last name @ou.edu.
Wonderful, but we've got people who can. Sorry, I called it Julie. I know
Vicky or Julie. Yeah.
There's all the Kathys and Julies and Vickys. So I suppose, did you have, yes?
I will ask a question. Thank you, very thought-provoking. As an economic historian, I was particularly taken with the notion that they were eschewing more profitable crops. And the theme of it being a civilising objective. Is that driving it, or is that a justification afterwards? And on the economic, on the factors of production side of it, is it the combination of land and labour needs? Perhaps it fills a niche that you can't do wheat as an alternative.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but I think what's really intriguing is just having started to do the research on Australia, look from the earliest days of Australian history, and they're talking about bringing in wines, many of whom were British immigrants who had never grown wine grapes, right? So there was something to this notion that it was somehow going to add to it. There's a new book out. Julie and I have, I can't think of the name of it now, so better I don't mention it. We may have some issues with. The other thing that's really intriguing about viticulture is choosing to put wines in a vineyard, or putting land into vineyards, means you're delaying any profits for years. It takes approximately 3 years before you can produce a viable crop. And then assuming you have to age it for some time, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what you found, at least in, and I can talk about the Napa Valley best, what you found in Napa was vineyards were planted from the beginning. From the first white settlement in the 1830s, vineyards are planted. Commercial production of vineyards starts in the late 1850s. Often those farmers who are growing grapes are growing other crops. And it's only really in the 1870s that you have people coming, usually with fortunes made in other industries, who are now putting in vineyards, really making that their main form of production. So the most famous one is a guy named Gustav Nibel, a Swedish or Swiss, I think Swedish ship captain who made a lot of money and creates Inglenook Winery. Eventually that name is bought and sold, but it's now, that winery has now been taken over by Francis Ford Coppola from the Godfather movie. And so you had people who could afford to do that, who could afford to take the time. And even if you continue into the future, so, you know, we talked about the devastating effects of prohibition in the 20th century. And it would really take the industry 30 years to recover, because you come out of repeal, you repeal it, you're in the middle of the Great Depression. Then you're in World War II. And so up until the mid-1960s, beef production was more profitable in Napa Valley than wine production. So it takes certain changes. It takes an elevation of the product you're producing. They had to plant better grapes. It takes time for consumer taste to change, right? These things are all tied together. So a lot of the wine being produced in California for much of the 19th and 20th century is what we would call jug wine, bulk wines, that most of us probably wouldn't want to drink today, right? Because our tastes have changed. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. And that notion that it is jug wine, if they weren't drinking that, what would they be drinking? Something uncivilized, something
Right.
that has class, gender overtones, whiskey.
And not good whiskey. Right.
Yeah. So part of the push for it is that this is a higher.
Right.
Right.
Right. And then what's really the breakthrough for Napa Valley is 1976. A British wine shop owner in Paris thought it'd be fun to have a competition between some French wines and some American wines. And to the surprise of everyone, the judges in a blind tasting picked a white and a red from Napa Valley. And just by happenstance, a reporter from Time magazine was there. So it's known as the Judgment of Paris. No one believes it meant that Napa supplanted France, but it did say Napa belonged. And so that changes the whole structure of the wine, and it begins to change the whole structure of the wine industry there. I bet it's the same here with Hunter Valley. The cost of entry becomes so high.
Yeah, it's
And Napa
interesting.
farmland's one of the most expensive in
It
the
was
world.
France that was holding up the popularity of wine.
Always blame the French. Get in trouble with the French.
Yeah.
And it used to be you could have cellar rats. People who started working in the vineyards in the cellars could work with the local banks, buy a winery, work their way up. But then it fades because it just goes too expensive. And so by the 1980s, who's getting to buy in? Large corporations or people bringing these other fortunes?
So how successful was Californian wine sort of as an export or globally? Or is its market mainly the US? I mean, because the US is known as a food exporter par excellence, right? Fed the world.
I don't have
So-
the numbers at my fingertips. I suspect that the majority of California, I don't want to confuse both lines. The majority of California wine is probably consumed in the domestic market, I think. But there is a substantial export market. I would assume it's fairly similar to what Australia experiences. And I don't have those percentages at my fingertips, even though I just read something this week.
Certainly today, it's on the shelves in the supermarkets in many countries.
I'm just gonna have to finish up here, but you can keep chatting, of course, because we've had most of our listeners have departed and said goodbye and thank you and all those nice things, including Tamsin, who'll be in touch. So thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate you being here. It's been a really great paper.
See you, Nance.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, thank you.
You never got to ask your